Fires. You are 5 times more likely to have your house burned down in 53206 than surrounding zip codes in Milwaukee. There are reasons for that. In 2021, Milwaukee's NPR station conducted a survey of properties in 53206. They hired a licensed electrician to inspect 50 randomly selected properties within the zip code. Of the 50 properties selected, they were given access to only 15 of them. Of the 15 buildings actually inspected, 80% of them had electrical code violations. There have been 3 uniform standards for wiring a house since the advent of in-home electricity. Currently, new construction utilizes copper wires that are insulated with plastic or enamel. That wire comes in solid or stranded versions. Before that, cloth-covered wire was standard. When you pull apart an outlet with 50-year-old cloth-covered wire, you can easily see why it has become obsolete. The cloth breaks down over time, especially when it's disturbed, and reveals the bare wire, which arcs or creates a spark when it comes in contact with something metal. Cloth-covered wire was installed in pipe, or this stuff called BX, which is flexible metal tube. With age, cloth-covered wire becomes brittle and often breaks off the cloth insulation where the wire exits the tube, leaving exposed live wires. It is extraordinarily cost-prohibitive to rewire a house, particularly in our neighborhood. I've done it a couple of times. It can cost as much or more than putting a new roof on a house and is the main limiting factor in the replacement of damaged or obsolete wiring. Before cloth-covered wire, knob and tube was the standard. Knob and tube wiring was designed to meet the most basic electrical needs that a family would have in the early 1900s. A few lights, maybe one outlet for a room, and nothing that draws a large amount of power. Knob and tube wiring is held in suspension within wall cavities by a set of porcelain tubes connected to porcelain knobs. It is ungrounded, which means the electricity has no way of safely returning back to the electrical panel if there is an issue. The insulation breaks down and can cause problems when anything comes into contact with it. It is often buried in the walls, and you may never know it's there until it causes a problem. On MLK Day in 2024, I woke up early to work on this book. It was cold that morning, with the temperatures at or slightly above zero. I haven't taken a day off of running in over 7 years, and I don't mind running in the cold, but running in the dark when it's icy doesn't make a ton of sense. I tried to pack my gym bag the night before, but that morning I realized I didn't grab a pair of socks, so I walked up the stairs to the laundry room to grab some. Our laundry room has 2 windows that face to the west, toward 9th Street. Reflecting off of the K-8 school were red, spinning, and white flashing lights. I'm used to that sight. We have a lot of police and emergency response presence within the neighborhood. Fire trucks and ambulances have red and white lights. Police cars have red and blue. There were more red lights than blue lights. 2 of the fire trucks and ambulances were parked directly in front of 2 of the houses we own. To the north, a woman was standing in the alley having a conversation on her phone. You're never ready for something terrible to happen in the neighborhood. There is never a good time for it. Emergencies rarely let you know before they become emergencies. I wanted to get in my truck and drive to the gym and go for a run, but if something happened at one of the properties, that should take precedent. It's part of the reason why I almost always run in the morning. Emergencies happen, and if you can take care of the responsibilities you place on yourself earlier in the day, it allows for emergencies to not interfere. This time, I couldn't not drive around the block to see what was going on. I know there are things that you can do to minimize the chances you're going to be in the middle of an emergency. Stability, financially, your own mental health, and within the dynamics of your relationships, keep emergencies from predictably happening more often. With the growing number of tenants we are responsible for providing safe and stable housing, the probability of having an emergency at one of the rentals increases. When you're responsible for anything beyond yourself, anxiety is natural when an emergency has taken place in close proximity. Based on the response, it looked unlikely that it was a shooting. Shootings draw a lot of police, and there wasn't as many blue lights as there would have been if it were a shooting. I grabbed the pair of socks, put my boots on, and headed outside to the truck. When I got to the intersection of 9th Street and the next main road to the south, I couldn't turn down the street. It was blocked off. When someone has a heart attack or calls an ambulance, the street doesn't get blocked off. This was more than that. The alley between 9th and 10th Street wasn't blocked off, so I turned down the alley. A quarter of the way down, I saw the house on fire. A couple of weeks into running We Got This, we realized we need more space. Next to the house that was on fire, for years, sat 3 empty lots. Houses once sat on those lots, but were torn down years ago before we moved here. The empty lots were slowly converted by kids from the garden into what we call the new garden. Someday it won't be called the new garden because there will be another newer garden that will take over the name. Of all of the spaces operated by We Got This, I spent the most time in the new garden over the last 2 years. Something you wouldn't expect about the inner city is how friendly everyone is. I'm still genuinely surprised by this, not because I've had interactions that would tell me otherwise, but because of what I hear from other people that look like me. I'm an outsider, and I know that. There isn't another upper-middle-class white man living here. I stand out and have stood out the entire time we've lived here. I never expect anyone to pay attention to me, but I still am surprised when I meet someone living only a block away that assumes I don't live here. I almost have to convince them that I do. Sitting in the alley watching the house burn, my mind flashed back to the first time I met the people living in that house. I live right over there, I told them, pointing in the direction of our house. Lived there a long time. One woman in particular was outside on the porch or in the backyard more than the others. Her name was Elaine. She was interested in what we were growing. She liked tomatoes and cucumbers, most people do, but was just happy that somebody was doing something with the lots. Up until then, those lots collected trash and were dumped on regularly. Psychologically, it is easier to make the mental leap that when you live in a place where people dump large quantities of trash, you live in a dump. Our alley, because of its proximity to a couple of busy streets, is one of the most dumped on places in the city. Those lots used to be constantly dumped on, and a garden is always better than a dump. At the actual dump, you can get mulch for free. The kids from We Got This spent some of the Saturdays moving mulch that I picked up at the dump around the space, building walkways between the planter boxes. On a Tuesday, I might go to the dump, load up the truck with mulch, and drop it off at the new garden. Elaine would be outside, and we would chat for a couple of minutes while I shoveled mulch out of the truck and into the pile for the kids to move the following Saturday. When I finally made it to the gym that morning, I got a text from Meg with a news article about the fire. Maybe 6 weeks before the fire, Meg was working at the original We Got This garden. Police and ambulances were parked up the street. In the middle of the row of emergency vehicles laid a man dead on the sidewalk. He was an older man that we knew from the neighborhood. Meg was told that he died of a drug overdose in a house and was taken outside and left on the sidewalk. In the news article Meg texted me, it said that one person died in the fire. People die horrifically more often in the inner city. It's undeniable. I haven't lived anywhere else where in the span of 2 blocks and 5 months someone is found lying dead on the street, shot in the alley, and burned alive in a house fire. Dying horrifically is a function of poverty, and because our neighborhood is overwhelmingly poor, people die horrifically here. Landmarks are a reminder of tragedy. I love driving. I got my license on my 16th birthday, and I haven't stopped loving it since. We take road trips every year. When my son turned 10, we drove to Kentucky to go to a Buc-ee's gas station, turned around, and then drove home. Of the contiguous 48 states, we've driven to like all but 5 of them at this point. On highways across the country in seemingly random locations are memorials for someone who died horrifically, small crosses with wreaths and names that are too small to read as you pass by. They mark the location of an accident. In our neighborhood, we have similar memorials. They're usually found on the tree that grows between the street and the sidewalk. a physical reminder of tragedy. We have memorials like this on nearly every block of the neighborhood. When you've lived somewhere a long time, you remember what has taken place there, even when the memorials are no longer physically there. A few days after Elaine died, it got a little warmer, the ice melted, and I went outside for a run. I ran down 8th Street, turned around, and ran home. Someone told me once that you should walk at the end of a run, so I adopted the habit of walking the last block. On our block alone, I walked past 3 spaces that are a physical reminder of horrific death. All of the trauma around horrific death has created a neighborhood PTSD. I've never heard this described by anyone, but I believe it to be true. PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, can occur after a traumatic experience on an individual level. But what happens when the trauma dots your neighborhood? In my own life, I have seen the effects of trauma, and I've seen those effects dissipate over time, but they're always there. What happens to a group of people comprising a neighborhood when traumatic events take place so often? Here's a list of symptoms of PTSD from the National Veterans Homeless Support website. Flashbacks, repeated and unwanted memories, intrusive thoughts, and nightmares about the traumatic event. Avoiding anything that reminds you of the traumatic event. Experiencing emotional or physical distress when reminded of the event. Hypervigilance, which is like being easily startled. Hypervigilance, which is being easily startled. Dwelling on negative emotions and or thoughts and having difficulty feeling positive. Insomnia, difficulty focusing, social isolation, changes in behavior, feeling irritable or angry, having aggressive or angry outbursts, risky or self-destructive behaviors including substance abuse, reckless driving, and other things. The items on this list that are outward expressions of trauma, ones that we can see, are often the types of things that make people not want to spend time in my neighborhood. It wouldn't surprise me if many of those instances are trauma-related, either directly associated with a person's own traumatic experience or the result of smaller traumas in close proximity to the individual. The physical reminders of trauma and horrific death don't go away quickly here. The house that burned down that morning when I was going to the gym was owned by a man. He lost the house due to tax foreclosure, and the city seized it for a period of time. About a year before the fire, that man regained ownership of the property. There's no way for me to know the financial situation of the man that regained ownership of the house, but I can make some assumptions. The property taxes for a house in my neighborhood are under $1,000 a year. If you do not pay the water bill quarterly, the cost is added to your property taxes at the end of the year. The quarterly water bill, which includes the cost of trash pickup, is like $200, which would raise the tax bill up to like $2,000 a year. If the house had a mortgage on it, the property taxes are paid through an escrow account. Many homes in our neighborhood do not have mortgages on them and have been handed down generationally. Based on the tax records found online, I assume there was no mortgage on the building. Not having the ability to make a $2,000 a year payment to maintain ownership paints a picture of financial distress. Without a mortgage, there is no oversight in regards to insurance. With no insurance and a track record of inability to pay property taxes, you could assume that the man owning the house can't afford the cost of demolition, which conservatively is $12,000. With an inability to cover the cost of demolition, the property will sit until it is foreclosed on by the city again. After a period of time, it will be placed on a list for demolition. As of November 2023, the waiting list for homes to be demolished was massive and backlogged for years. Based on other houses that have burned down in the neighborhood, I would estimate that this house will sit for 3 to 4 years before it's torn down, serving as a physical reminder of death and tragedy. Later in the day, on MLK Day, we learned that the person who died was a woman. She was in her early 60s. The next day, we learned that Elaine Veasley was her name. We also learned that the building did not have working smoke detectors. But I could have told you that. Not because I ever checked, but because of the condition of the rest of the building. The house wasn't in good shape, and I don't mean it wasn't in good shape like nearly all of the buildings here. I mean, for the buildings here, it wasn't in good shape. The newspaper article shared that the building was serving as a rooming house. I don't know if that's true or not. Rooming houses rent rooms for a short period of time. They're the lowest form of a rental and attract people that need and can only afford a room, not necessarily a whole unit. Rooming houses are supposed to have their own set of guidelines, but any rental can be a rooming house. The guidelines are meant to provide structure to the number of people that can safely inhabit a space. It isn't necessarily an enforceable policy. If I wanted to maximize my profits for the buildings we own, I could turn them into rooming houses, find people to rent them by the week, and cycle people in and out of the property. But that wouldn't work to build a strong, stable community, so we don't do that. Tiffany is a woman who lived next to the house Elaine died in. One day, maybe in 2012, Tiffany knocked on our door and asked if we would buy her house. I know it's just because I'm white, but more often people living here assume I have money. Of course, we have some now, but in 2012, we were a ways off from being financially sound. Still, I don't turn down opportunities to go look at houses, and I followed her down the alley to take a look at her house. She told me she was a school bus driver. I've ridden enough school buses full of kids to know that it's a terrible job if you get the wrong route. I also know you don't work 8 hours a day, typically 2 or 3 in the morning and 2 or 3 in the afternoon with a break in the middle. As we walked through her house, I understood. Her house was in danger of foreclosure. She couldn't afford the property taxes, which at the time, again, were under $1,000 a year and closer to $500 than $1,000. Her and her family owned another building that was recently foreclosed on by the city and was burned down as a training exercise by the fire department. That house sat between hers and the home Elaine died in. The upstairs of that building had almost no working electricity. No working electricity would have been better than some. No working electricity would have indicated an issue at the panel or somewhere between where the electrical service enters the building and meets the panel in the basement. Only about a fourth of what should have worked did. That told me that there were live wires hidden behind the walls without terminating at an outlet or a light. The kind of stuff that causes problems, like electrical fires. She sold that building to someone else who threw a coat of paint on the outside, the same color as the ugly blue house, and they rented it out within a few months, clearly not addressing the electrical issues. The memories of life lost stay around too. It's not an inner city specific experience. I assume it's universal. In the days after the fire, I thought about Elaine a lot. I didn't know much about her other than what I gleaned from the couple of dozen interactions we had. I didn't know much about her family or where she grew up, but I liked her. I looked forward to seeing her when I dropped off mulch or when I worked with kids on a Saturday in the garden. I'm going to miss talking with her. When I drive by her house, I can't not think of her. But the memories are different now. We don't get to choose how we die, but all of us have hope for what the end will be like. No one would choose to die the way she did. Living here, I've learned that poverty more predictably robs you of the choice for how you will spend the last moments of your life.